Hey guys, Frank here with another episode of Modern Church Leader, here with my buddy who actually helped produce Modern Church Leader, Travis Albritton. Did I get it right?
That's right. Yes, you did. Yes, you did.
Guys, when you see this episode and you look at his last name, you're going to be like, that's a tricky one. I don't know if I would have got it right. So,
yeah. I mean, so to start with a story, because that's always a good way to start a podcast.
Please.
My name has been butchered quite a bit, but my favorite, and it's to the point where I'm almost like kind of jealous that this isn't my last name. Somebody said Travis Albritton, like I was some kind of transformer.
Yes.
And I was like, that would actually be a pretty solid stage name. So if I ever like become a meteorologist or need to, join the Actors Guild and I need a stage name, I might be Travis Albritton in the future.
Yeah, Travis Albritton. My boys would love that. They're like obsessed with Transformers right now.
Yeah, it's a good thing to be obsessed with as a young kid.
Yeah. Oh, and as a dad, to have your kids obsessed with Transformers. It's just fun,
Absolutely.
Transformers and Legos. Like,
yes.
Can't go wrong. Well, man, thanks for jumping on the show today. Appreciate your time.
Yeah.
And I mean, you're somewhat of a podcast professional. So you've kind of gone off and started your own thing recently, but you spent a bunch of years doing podcasts for Buzzsprout and have helped us at Tithely for a while. So why don't you give people a little bit of your background and kind of how you got into the industry?
Sure. So my initial background coming out of college was actually in aerospace engineering. So I went to school to be a rocket scientist.
Natural fit.
Then, yeah. So then, naturally being a podcast content creator would be the next step. But the way that I pivoted into that was I got 4 or 5 years into my career and decided it wasn't what I wanted to do for the next 30 or 40 years.
Right.
And I had a big heart for ministry. And so I thought, well, maybe I can take some of these online business strategies that are working, selling courses, info products. Maybe I can do that in like the Christian space and just be like self-supported doing online ministry. And so I started exploring that. And a part of that world is content marketing, podcasting being one of the mediums that people use.
Right.
And so I had started a couple podcasts and really fell in love with it as a way to connect with people, build an audience, and share your thoughts and your values with the world. And by developing those skills as a side gig in addition to my job, then I was able to pivot into doing it professionally, working for Buzzsprout, as you mentioned, which is a company in the podcasting space as a content creator. So they brought me in to be on their marketing team, basically as the person recording the videos, recording the podcasts, writing the blogs, coming up with the content, and helping grow Buzzsprout into the #1 podcast host in the world. And so I did that for almost 4 years before I then pivoted into my own podcast production agency where I work with businesses and organizations to craft really great branded podcasts that help them to get their message out, whether that's a sales-oriented podcast or a donor-based podcast if you're a nonprofit. Don't work with too many churches, but the ones that I do hold a special place in my heart. So that's how we got to today.
Yeah. And how did you get, I mean, since we speak mostly to pastors and church leaders on our podcast, I mean, what's your kind of journey into faith and how'd you get connected to the church and like, where did the intersection of business and church start becoming a thing for you?
Sure. So I grew up going to church. Both my parents became Christians in college.
Okay.
And so I always grew up knowing that God existed, that Jesus came to the earth, and like I knew all of these things. But then in middle school, I decided that I knew better in my infinite wisdom as a 12-year-old. And, because it's one thing to like know it intellectually. It's another to embrace it.
I have 3 that are going to be 12 here soon. So
yeah.
The day is coming.
But yeah, it's quite another to like live out the life of Jesus, right? And I wasn't interested in that in the least. So I started going my own way, but then as luck would have it, life has a way of kind of beating your pride into submission, whether you want it to or not. And so I got halfway through high school and was just not in a good place and thought, well, maybe I'll give this God thing a shot. I don't have anything else going for me. And so I started, I got with a friend of mine who was, older and I trusted and knew the Bible well. So just teach me what the Bible says. Like, I want to know the real deal. I want to know if this is legit or not. Yeah. And as I studied the Bible, I became more and more convinced that like not only is the Bible the word of God, but it has everything that I'm looking for. Not necessarily the answers to every single particular question, but the keys to unlocking a life of hope, purpose, and fulfillment, and connecting my life to something bigger than myself. And so that was the pivot that I was like, all right, I'm all in.
Yeah.
You got me. And so that was when I was 16, became a disciple, became a Christian, and then have just really had a heart for ministry since then. Have had a natural knack for teaching and speaking, which kind of lends itself well in the Christian world when you get opportunities to do lessons and you do a half decent job. They're like, oh, well, maybe you should do more of these. And so I was lucky to be able to train under just some phenomenal pastors and ministers. But really, it was the intersection with the business world came from, being in that place, like I mentioned, of being unhappy and unfulfilled in my career as an engineer and wanting to figure out how I can do ministry, but without kind of going the traditional ministry route. Because my wife, not necessarily interested in doing full-time ministry.
Right.
And we had just moved to a new city and she wasn't excited about moving again. And so if you're trying to pursue full-time ministry and you're not willing to move, then it's very hard to get a job at a place where you can really sink in and invest, and where like everything's aligned doctrinally and values and you're a good fit and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. It's very difficult. And so that was kind of like a way for me to try and split the difference, to say, we don't have to move, but I still want to have a ministry focus in my life. Love it, dude.
Love it. Well, now you're doing your thing, and maybe you'll help more and more churches that you've kicked off and started your own thing. But podcasts have been blowing up, right? Like over, I don't know how many years. It's like they're increasingly getting more and more, I guess, influence and important. But why do you think the medium of podcasting has gotten so big and popular and, just really exploded?
So I think the thing that sets podcasting apart from every other kind of internet content, and that's a buzzword that's used a lot, but essentially media that you consume, whether it's something you listen to, something you watch, something you read. Podcasting is the only form of internet media that you can consume while you're doing something else. So it's hard to watch a YouTube video while you're driving, right? Yeah. At least safely. Maybe in the future, once we get Tesla Autopilot 4.0, maybe you can watch YouTube while you're going down the freeway. But until then, you're not going to be watching a YouTube video. You're not going to be reading a blog. Hopefully you're not scrolling through social media while you're barreling down the highway. Yeah. And the same thing goes with working out at the gym. Video, you can get a little bit more of that. It's hard to read something when you're doing chores around the house. So it's just very accessible in that you can listen to it while you're doing other things. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of people have kind of incorporated podcast listening into their lives, where it's a complement to what they're doing instead of having to choose between this or that. Right. And so I think that's one of the big reasons why it has gained traction. And then I think the other reason it's gained traction is because with a podcast, you can find something that talks about exactly what you want to learn about, right? So Frank, like, what is the most like niche specific thing that you listen to that your wife would not want to listen to in a million years?
Oh, like anything related to like startups and building startups and investing in startups, and like she could care less. Right. She loves the work of Tithely and kind of what we've done, but that's sort of right. It's different. But listening to that kind of content, she would never.
Right. So like you love the All In podcast.
Yeah.
It's a really great podcast if you're interested in the VC funding world and like startups and businesses and that kind of stuff. If you're not, that's like, you might as well just like sign me up to watch paint dry. That's like the least thing.
I turned it on just to make the point.
Yeah.
I got in the car and Apple CarPlay came on, and the podcast screen came up. And so it listed kind of like some of the recent ones. And one of my boys was in the car with me and he's like, "What's that?" I'm like, "Oh, it's this podcast." Like, "What's a podcast?" I'm like, "Well, let me turn one on." So I hit play and, we got through like 90 seconds and he's like, "This is terrible, Dad. Turn the radio back
on." Yeah. Yeah. And so for me, like I listen to business podcasts, marketing podcasts, ministry podcasts, like theology podcasts. Like that's my jam.
Right.
My wife wants to listen to the podcast where they're like doing the breakdowns of the TV shows that she watches.
Right.
And it's like, I just don't want to hear 5 people talking to each other about a TV show we just watched. Like I was there, I watched the episode. I don't need the after party, and so I think what's really cool about podcasting too is that it becomes personal because you kind of curate your own list of shows that you love to listen to because they speak to interests that you have and they speak to things that you want to dig into. And so you can't do that with radio. You can find radio stations that are kind of like a genre of music that you listen to, but it's not like a specific program that's on demand that you can listen to as you're doing something else. And so I think all of those things kind of lend themselves to podcasting being a great internet-based platform because it has all those things going for it. It's hard to find in other places.
No, I get it. I mean, and I guess bringing this into the church world, like, do you think church leaders, pastors, ministers, people, ministry leaders should get into podcasting? Like, do you think it's something that more and more should get into? They're already speaking, so they're doing kind of not exactly the same thing, but they're creating a lot of content.
Yeah. So I think a lot of churches during COVID, we had our own come to Jesus moment of, all right, well, how are we going to have church if everyone's stuck at home? And having to figure out, what does this live stream thing look like? How do we use Zoom? How do we use these internet platforms to stay connected and continue to be a church family together, right? And to continue to fellowship and invest in each other and have relationships. And so now we're coming out on the back end of that, and we're starting to get back to some sense of normalcy. But now we have some technological literacy. Right. And so I think the sell or the leap to say, we're going to have a podcast for our church, where our pastor is going to start a podcast in order to connect with people in the congregation or other congregations you're connected to, is not as far-fetched as it was 2 years ago. Right. 2 years ago, it's like, why would a church have a podcast? That makes no sense.
I think it's 3 years ago.
I guess time is a funny thing in the world of a global pandemic. It's like, wait, was that last month or 4 years ago? I don't remember. Everything blends together, right? But I think the value of a podcast is that it's relatively easy to record the content. You don't have to write a blog post, which for a lot of people is really hard to do, to sit down and just write something. If I never have to write a 5-paragraph essay the rest of my life, I'll be very happy. Right. And with video, there's a lot of moving pieces that can be overwhelming when you're first getting started, as far as just gear and getting it to look good. But with a podcast, you can just start with some Apple Earpods in your iPhone and just start recording your thoughts. And that could be a podcast. And so I think gear-wise, the technology is very accessible, and a lot of tools have popped up to make it really easy to produce and publish a podcast. And so I think it really just comes down to deciding what you want to say that's worth listening to. Right. But once you unlock that piece that goes beyond the Sunday sermon, then that is where a podcast can be really valuable, not just for you as a pastor, but for your congregation as well.
Well, how can pastors, maybe just some tips or some ideas or some thinking around, like, what would I do? Right? Like, I preach, right? And they're spending a lot of time preparing sermons, preparing their message, Bible study, all the things that go into putting on a great Sunday morning message. Like, how do you go from that and then kind of bring that into a podcast? Because you don't necessarily, at least I don't think you want to go reproduce the same thing, because you can just record yourself and kind of like turn that into a podcast if you want. But any thoughts, or have you seen anything that works really well, or any examples where you go, oh, that guy's doing a great job with kind of spinning off from the Sunday experience?
Yeah. So I think it's helpful to think about where someone's going to be when they're consuming a podcast versus where they are on a Sunday morning. Right. So typically the way that most churches are set up, it's like a stage audience dynamic, right? There's a person on a stage behind a pulpit doing a lesson, and then you have this audience that's kind of watching the stage unfold. Right. There's merits to that, and there's pros and cons, but that's just kind of how it is. And so that lends itself to a certain communication style. With a podcast, it feels much more like you're sitting on a couch next to each other, having a conversation, right? So like our conversation, it's not like right now, the tone isn't like, rah, rah, go get them. Right. It's just like, we're just talking about something, right? And so think about the conversations you're already having in people's living rooms. That becomes the podcast. Yeah. So it's not necessarily trying to invent something new. It's just capturing conversations you're having repeatedly with people and saying, you know what? Other people would benefit from hearing this. So let me anonymize it. So take specific names out, so you're not like putting them people on blast and gossiping. Right. But saying, hey, like I was giving this advice to somebody in our church the other day, and I felt like it could be helpful for everyone. So I just want to share it here on a podcast. And then you just kind of reiterate the same thing that you just told that person. But now you've taken something that happened in a one-on-one interaction and you've multiplied it to 100, 200, 500 people, however many people are in your church.
Yeah.
And so now everyone gets to be a part of that living room conversation. So I think that is the power. Once you step away from the Sunday morning experience and you think about all the other ways that you pastor and all the other ways that you minister to people in your church, and the podcast can now be an opportunity for you to take those individual interactions and take the best bits of those, put them together, and then create that as a resource for your members through the week. Because that's always the hard thing as a congregant, right?
Yeah.
Is you have Sunday, which kind of like fuels up your battery, and you're like, okay, now I got to get through the entire week if I don't have small group or a midweek service or something like that.
Yeah.
And so you're at fumes by the end of the work week. But if you can have these little itty bitty bite-sized spiritual nuggets that you can hold on to, that you can listen to, consider, implement, apply in your life, then that can be something that carries you through the week. And you now have an opportunity to talk about things that wouldn't necessarily make sense to talk about on a Sunday. And so, the rule of thumb for announcements is if it doesn't apply to at least 50% of the people in your church, it probably shouldn't be an announcement.
Right. Yeah.
But if you're doing a podcast, you can take something that only applies to 10% of people and spend an episode talking about it, because that's a really good place to put that.
Right.
And so I think having that as a communication channel opens up a lot of opportunities that you don't have with just a church newsletter and a Sunday service.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that idea. I also think there might be something to just like, hey, you put this, message together. There's probably a lot that went into that, and there's probably a lot that didn't make the message, or things that maybe got sparked because you did the message, and maybe conversations happened. And, there's probably a lot of material that's kind of like the before and the after that isn't the same thing, but it's like stuff that happened because of, the Sunday lesson or the weekend lesson. And there can even be one on, okay, it's the small group. It's for small group leaders, right? How to take that and go into a small group experience and talk about that kind of stuff. So, man, there's tons of ideas out there for creating just a great podcast. Yeah. And anyway, so how does someone get started? Like what's the gear that, like, if a pastor, okay, I want to do this, I want to get into it, I'm going to do a podcast once a week or something like that. What do they need to get? I mean, you mentioned your iPhone and AirPods, but what else is there to, put together the toolkit to go do this?
So the best resource that I know of, partially because I helped make it, is there's a blog post on Buzzsprout's website called How to Start a Podcast.
I mean,
it breaks down.
You're going to have to put this blog post on ChristCenteredMarketing.com and your version of it, just because you should.
I'm totally fine with sharing, it's totally fine. But in that blog post, it'll go through and here are the microphones and here's the software you need and here's how you upload it. And so it'll give you all the technical stuff that you need. But you can buy a $60 microphone, USB microphone on Amazon. That's going to sound really good. And that's a great starting place. So I would not overthink it in the beginning on the gear side. I would either start with what you have, just like a microphone that you have laying around, and then record into either your laptop using QuickTime or GarageBand. There are free audio recording softwares for Windows computers as well. Just like find one that's free, start recording things. And then when you find something that's worth uploading and sharing, then you upload it to a place called a podcast host, which then distributes it for you. Right. So that's the technical stuff. And that's actually the easy part is identifying, okay, here's my shopping list. Here are the things I need to do. And then finding someone on the AV team that's like, I want to help produce the podcast so that you're not also, most pastors are struggling for free time as it is. Yeah. So adding podcast producer to their title and list of responsibilities, probably not high on their priority list. But if you can find someone who's eager, that's like, yeah, that's something I'm passionate about. I love podcasts. I want to learn how to make podcasts. Find somebody in your church you can partner with that can take over all the production stuff for you and learn how to do that. And then you can just focus as the minister, as the pastor, on the content itself. Right. What do you want to say?
Right.
And how do you want to say it? But the technical stuff is all relatively simple.
Have you seen these little Rode microphones that I see popping up all the time now? They little clip on, and sometimes people are just holding them.
Yep.
Seems like they're connected like to somebody's iPhone or something like that. It seems so simple.
Yeah.
Like even just a couple
called
years back, like that didn't exist, but
Right.
that little thing seems to be just brilliant.
Yeah, it's a wireless lavalier microphone is what it's called.
Yeah.
And so it clips to your shirt. Whenever you do the Tithely Next event, you guys have an array of microphones that you use, right? But it's basically, instead of having a microphone that's kind of like the ones that we're using,
Yeah.
that are like on stands, it's just one that clips to your shirt. And you can find some that do plug right into your phone.
Yeah.
You can just record straight on your phone. And it's got
record straight to the phone.
Quality.
Then there's probably an app that lets you upload it to some
Absolutely.
pod, and then it's that easy, right? You've removed all the barriers. You won't do a lot of editing that way, but
no,
be that
but
simple.
but if you're not trying to, so I think here's an obstacle that holds a lot of churches back. They think if they're going to produce media for the internet, it needs to be at like Elevation
Right.
or Bethel or Hillsong level. It's like, that's not who you're competing against. And that's not who you're creating content for. So I think the value of a podcast for a small to mid-sized church, less than 2,000 members, is that you know your members by name.
Right.
Like that's not something that you can replicate at scale. And who is better equipped to serve them with the needs that they actually have in their life? You, because you're plugged into that. And so I think once you frame the podcast and the scope of the podcast to not be about how do we create something for all of Christendom, but how do we create something for us that meets our needs,
Right.
that helps us with where we are going, So like you said, like you have a Sunday sermon, then maybe on Tuesday you record something. It's the process of how you put the sermon together and all the things that you didn't cover or resources that you discovered as you were researching to put that lesson together and sharing those things with people that want to go deeper and want to be good Bereans and not just take your word for it, but actually do their own study.
Right.
Like there are opportunities to do things that go deeper within your congregation. And so when you create the podcast that's perfect just for your church, then that's where it really unlocks the potential to be a great asset to you in your ministry.
Right.
That you don't have to have your own TBN network in order to do a podcast and to do it well.
Yeah. And the other thing I love about this is I think, going back to your point, COVID, we're coming off of that. A lot of tech literacy happened. Also, church dynamics kind of changed in a big way, right? Like every church I talk to, this concept of hybrid church, there's less people in the building, like everybody's struggling through it. And I think every church is being forced to think about how to do ministry online. Like something like, that like the online universe is now important for their ministry. And it's different for every church. So I'm not meaning this in a blanket way, but I do think that, churches are trying to figure it out, and having a podcast or a YouTube channel or any version of this kind of sort of online content where you're extending what you do in the building to the digital space is like creating engagement and touch points with your church members and your family on non-weekend, right? Non-Sunday, even non-midweek. Like, people are going to church 1-2 times a month sometimes, right? And those are like the committed members, and you need ways to get to them. So, I just think the podcast has a lot of benefits in that sense too, right? Not just the, I'm doing a podcast and I might reach millions. It's like, it might just be your church of 200 that you're getting more time with because they're consuming that content outside of the weekends.
Yeah. Like imagine you can record a 30-minute conversation, and then instead of having to have that same conversation with 100 people, you just have it once and 100 people listen to it.
Totally.
Right. So that's where you get the scale that you can't get at a human interaction. And something else I'll throw in too, and connect this to something that we've all widely accepted, no matter kind of where you are on the futurist side of the spectrum. There was a period of time where churches did not have websites, and it was like totally fine. It's like if you have a building,
some still don't, shockingly.
Well, if they're listening to Modern Church Leader, hopefully they have at least started the process of a website, right? Yes. But it used to be that if you had a building and you had a sign out front that said what time your services were, you would have new people showing up every week, because that's how people discovered new churches or tested them out or tried them out. And so that was fine. And then the behavior of people shifted. where it wasn't just with church, but like anytime I'm going to a new city, I look up what are the best places to eat and I read reviews. Whenever I'm on Amazon trying to buy something, I read the reviews. Like, is this good? Is this a Wish knockoff? Like, how do I know I'm getting what I think I'm getting?
Right.
And so just collectively as a society, we've been trained before you go and do something in person, you go online to research it, just to vet it, to make sure it's worthwhile. And so as a church, before people come to your service in person, they're looking you up online. They're looking at your socials. They're looking at the content you're creating as a way of seeing, like, what is this church really about? Like, what do they stand for?
Yeah.
What's their creeds, their doctrines? What kind of children's ministry do they have? They're trying to get all those answers before they even show up, before you even know that they're remotely interested in coming to your church.
Right.
And so whereas before you could kind of get away with not having a website, it's like table stakes now.
Yeah.
Because people aren't going to show up to a church if they can't find it online. And so this is going to be the next iteration of that now people are going to start listening to your online sermons. They're going to be listening to your podcast, be watching your YouTube videos to see what kind of church is this?
Right.
Is this a church that I feel safe going to? Is this a church where I would feel comfortable being there on a Sunday? Do I see people that look and sound like me in these videos on this podcast?
Right.
Do I feel like I'm going to fit in, I'm going to belong and not stick out like a sore thumb? These are all things that people are doing now before they even show up to church. And so by adding a podcast to the mix, that just continues to grow the number of touch points that you have with people and give them the confidence to be there and to connect with your church ultimately.
Yeah. And it's great content for your website, right? Like churches also struggle with having relevant, like new stuff. So if you have a website and you're doing a weekly podcast, like that podcast can be located on your website. So at least you have something fresh. You're posting your sermon, you got your podcast going, and at least you've got some new stuff showing up there and it's not getting stale. It doesn't have Christmas 2021 or 2020 on the homepage when we're about to hit 2022.
Or the senior pastor from 5 years ago that doesn't work there anymore.
Yeah, right.
Still listed in the,
Exactly. So, I mean, how do you think about what it would cost, or just we talked a little bit about the gear, but just, to start a podcast, what should a church be thinking in terms of just cost?
So just like shoestring budget, just getting in the beginning. If you can carve out $50 a month, that can cover all of the tools and the software that you need to run a really good indie podcast, something that's not produced by a big company. And then it's just sweat equity. It's just you sitting down to record something, having someone edit it, upload it, write some show notes, distribute it, and then telling people about it.
Right.
So the great thing about podcasting is much more labor intensive than capital intensive, which is great. Because churches are always full of people that have eager hearts that want to serve. Yeah. And so for $50 a month, you can do everything that you need to do in order to make a great podcast. Yeah. And I just think that's like almost, it's pennies, right? It's like not a lot of money. And I think church leaders are already, just even in some of the examples, like they're already producing a lot of content, right? Whether that's the sermon or the counseling appointments or the Bible studies or dealing with church issues, like there's stuff going on all the time that is relevant in some way to their members, the churchgoers, their community, right? Even churches could start podcasts that are about like their community and bringing in community leaders and businesses and all kinds of, like, there's so many things that folks could do, but it's already happening, right? So it's almost just taking that extra time to think about, okay, how do I package it into a podcast to get it out there? And it really doesn't cost a whole lot of money. So I love that. Well, we'll kind of wrap it up. If people have questions, we're going to tell them where to find you, but you do this now. So like as a professional who helps people with podcasts, like one, what do you guys do over at your company? And like, what are some of the, like, I don't know, the first steps that people should be taking to kind of move down the right path? Sure. So my company's called Christ Center Marketing. So I partner with Christian-owned businesses and organizations, churches would fall into that category, to create podcast content. And so as an agency, a production agency, I basically take the recorded content and then do everything after that, whether that's cutting it into clips, writing show notes, publishing it, all those kind of things, helping market it and promote it. And so that's what I do and where my expertise is and what my business does. Yeah. And so if that sounds interesting, like, hey, we got a little bit more budget, this is something we want to outsource, do it at a professional level, then you can just go to christcenteredmarketing.com, and there's a button where you can schedule a time to chat, and we'll just talk about you and your needs. And, I'll even point you in the right direction if I'm not a good fit. So if you're at the place where you know that you want to start a podcast and you just need some more guidance, I'd be happy to help, and that'd be the best place to go.
Yeah. Yeah. Love that. Okay. I got a couple questions, rapid fire, end it out. Just fun things that I love to learn about people. Who's a church leader, or, I could be a business leader, but who's some sort of leader that you've looked up to over the years and learned a lot from?
Somebody who's been on this podcast, actually, Christian Ray.
Nice.
So Christian is pastor of the Tribe in Austin, Texas.
Yeah.
And what I love about his approach to ministry is that he is just a phenomenal chameleon. And what I mean by that is it's very hard sometimes for churches to strike the balance of being relatable and being culturally relevant with also being doctrinally sound, and not like wishy-washy and, okay, well, what's the flavor of the month? Well, we'll just kind of accept that as being the new truth.
Right.
And so he does a phenomenal job of striking that balance. And God's really blessed that ministry. And so I really look up to him a lot when I think about how to do ministry moving forward, especially for my generation, for millennials and the ones that are coming after, where that really matters, right? That level of accessibility and authenticity is important.
Yeah.
And they're not interested in going to their parents' church. They want to find a church for them. I think Christian is phenomenal. And so definitely go back and listen to his episode here on Modern Church Leader.
Yeah. He's got a good one.
I'm sure you'll come away with the same impression.
Yeah. I love that. I'll make sure not to tell him you said that. We don't want him to get too excited. What's a book that you just think everybody should read?
So I think, this is something that has come across recently, and it's not necessarily a Christian book. It's Integrity Selling for the 21st Century, How to Sell the Way People Want to Buy. And whether you're a pastor or someone in the business space, the reason I think this book is really valuable is it helps you to understand the psychology of how people make informed buying decisions that they are really excited about. And so if you think about sales, it's not just buying used cars. It could be becoming a member of your church. That's a sales process. They're giving you something in exchange for something else, right? And so if you can apply the principles that he talks about in integrity selling to the way that you onboard members into your church and the way that you help people progress through your church and understand what are people thinking about at various stages of that process, you can then speak into each of those objections and questions that people would have to really help smooth out that process and that journey and help them feel even more welcomed into your church than they already are. Mm-hmm. So that's a book that I recommend to all business people that I know, but I think for churches as well, it could be really valuable.
Yeah, that's a great one. Okay, what's a podcast that you're listening to right now?
Right now, it would have to be, what's one that I'm listening to that I want to share? It would have to be Bema podcast. So it's a tie between that and Bible for Normal People, but I'll go with Bema for this one. So Marty Solomon is the host, and what I love about his perspective is that he is like hereditarily Jewish, but is a Christian and has studied under Jewish rabbis. And so he understands the Old Testament better than any other Christian that I know, and really brings a life and a connectedness to the Bible that really, for me, unlocked a lot of things. Just understanding the Old Testament and the value of really reading it the way that a Jew would in the time that it was written, and how all of those things point and connect to Jesus is really amazing. And so if you're interested in going deeper and learning a different approach and perspective on reading, especially the Old Testament, but the New Testament as well, then the Bema podcast is fantastic. BEMA,
right?
BEMA. Yep.
BEMA. Check it out. Look it up on all the podcast places. Man, this has been awesome. Where can folks go? You mentioned the website, but mention it again. Where should they go to learn more about you and what you guys are up to?
Sure. So christcenteredmarketing.com is the website. And then if you love learning about digital marketing, I actually have a podcast called Honest Marketing, which Frank was a guest on.
Yes.
Which is great. And so there we talk about proven strategies to help grow your business, your enterprise, whatever you're working on, without selling your soul. And so if you want your business growth to be aligned with your values as a disciple of Jesus, then that's the podcast you should be listening to.
Love it, man. Love it. Go to Christ-Centered Marketing. Check out the pod. I'm sure you have the podcast on your website too, so they'll find it there. Well, Travis, this has been great. Thanks for sharing all your wisdom about how to do podcasting And man, hopefully 2023, a bunch of new churches and pastors start getting into it.
That'd be great. That'd be good for all of us.
It'd be good for all of us. Well, thanks guys for listening or watching on YouTube. We will check you guys next week on another episode of Modern Church Leader. Bye-bye.